At my father's memorial service in Boston, the air smelled of lilies and varnished wood. The church was full. Colleagues, judges, donors, men who measured themselves by proximity to power. They spoke in tempered voices about integrity, about discipline, about legacy. I stood beside the closed casket and accepted their hands. Your father was impeccable. They used that word more than once. Impeccable. He had built his life around it. Tailored suits, controlled gestures, strategic friendships. My childhood had been a rehearsal for that image. Sit straight. Speak carefully. Never reveal more than necessary. After the final hymn, when the crowd softened and the organ quieted, I felt the familiar sensation of being observed, not by mourners, by calculation. A woman approached me near the side aisle, mid-60s, silver hair drawn back, navy coat cut with restraint. She did not offer sympathy. "Evelyn Ward," she said, "your father retained me in limited matters." Her handshake was brief, efficient. She handed me a thick envelope sealed in deep red wax. No courier stamp, no address. "For you," she said. "That's all?" "That's sufficient." She left before I could ask more. I did not open it in the church. I waited until I was alone in my father's office upstairs, in the brownstone he insisted on keeping separate from the firm. The room was unchanged. Mahogany desk, leather chair, law books arranged by height, not subject. His degrees hung on the wall. Harvard, Columbia, honors in gold frames. I closed the door. The wax seal cracked cleanly under my thumb. Inside was a single letter and attached copies of trust documentation. The letter was formal, precise. It referenced fiduciary continuity in the event of death and exposure contingencies. The title at the top stopped me, Project Ironbridge. Halfway down the page, another name appeared, Senator Daniel Harper. The letter described a transatlantic charitable structure, an American foundation operating in New York, a British discretionary trust seated in London, asset layering, cross-border advisory shields, and then my last name, Reed, not as daughter, as structural liaison. I read the paragraph twice before allowing the meaning to settle. My father had not merely advised this structure, he had engineered it. He had tied a sitting U.S. senator to a network of charitable entities that moved funds legally, invisibly, and under reputational cover, technically compliant, strategically insulated, publicly unassailable. I sat down in his chair and let the silence do its work. Below, guests were still speaking about his character. My father had believed in appearance as doctrine. He curated dinner tables the way other men curated portfolios, judges at one end, corporate counsel at the other, conversations that sounded ethical and felt negotiated. After college, he had expected me to join a private firm. He had arranged interviews without asking. The right trajectory, he called it. I declined. Instead, I joined a federal investigative agency, analytical division, financial structures, cross-border compliance. He did not argue. He simply adjusted his tone. "Experience is useful," he said. "Connections are permanent." I learned early that connections are also leverage. In the agency, my last name meant nothing. It was an identifier, not a credential. What mattered were patterns, documentation, gaps in reported flows, inconsistencies between charitable mission statements and fund distributions. I specialized in layered trusts and offshore vehicles, quiet structures designed to survive scrutiny. Ironbridge had surfaced 18 months ago in an internal review, a flag transfer between a Manhattan-based foundation and a London trust with opaque beneficiaries. The amounts were structured just below mandatory disclosure thresholds. It had drawn my attention because it was careful. Careful is rarely accidental. The internal file designation had been simple, IRB-47. I did not know then what it stood for. Now I did. Back in the office, I aligned the documents on my father's desk. The attached copies included trustee meeting minutes. Harper's name appeared as honorary chair, Non-executive, advisory only, technically removed from operational control, practically embedded. A separate page outlined reputational buffers in the event of inquiry, language so deliberate it bordered on choreography. My father had anticipated scrutiny. He had also anticipated death. The letter concluded with a statement that chilled me not because it was dramatic, but because it was calm. In the event of destabilizing inquiry, continuity relies on disciplined discretion. Discretion. That word had governed my childhood. When I miscalculated a response at the dinner table, he would place his fork down softly and say, "We don't perform weakness publicly." I never forgot it. Downstairs, someone laughed. A low, familiar sound. One of his former partners. I folded the letter once, then again. I placed it inside my bag. When I returned to the reception area, a senior partner approached me with a measured expression. "You'll maintain his standing," he said. "The Reed name carries weight." "I'm aware," I replied. He mistook that for agreement. Outside, Boston was gray and disciplined. Harbor wind pressed against the buildings without ceremony. I stood on the church steps and allowed myself exactly one private acknowledgement. My last name was now attached to something combustible, not because it was illegal, because it was designed to avoid being examined. I did not feel anger toward my father. I felt confirmation. He had always believed systems could be shaped quietly from within. So did I. The difference was intent. That evening, in my apartment, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. I made digital copies. I logged timestamps. I cross-referenced the trust identifiers with our internal database from memory before accessing anything formally. Precision first, action later. I opened the archived IRB 47 file, transfers from a U.S. educational foundation to a London-based charitable trust. On paper, funding scholarships and infrastructure grants. In practice, circular reinvestments through advisory subsidiaries that benefited consulting firms aligned with Harper's policy initiatives. Legal, strategically conflicted, regulatory gray. Ironbridge was not theft, it was insulation, a network designed to allow influence without fingerprints. I closed the file and stared at my reflection in the dark window above the sink. Reed. For years, that name opened rooms. Judges assumed competence. Partners assumed loyalty. Soon it would surface beside the word scandal. I did not intend to defend it. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. Fluorescent lights hummed. Analysts moved quietly between cubicles. I requested expanded audit authority on IRB 47 under routine compliance review. No commentary, no explanation. "Is there urgency?" my supervisor asked. "Structural inconsistencies," I said. "Documentation gap." He nodded. That was enough. Over the following weeks, I traced the pattern. Funds moved from New York to London under scholarship allocation. London Trust reinvested through advisory channels linked to policy research groups. Those groups contracted with firms whose board memberships overlapped with Harper's campaign donors. Conflict of interest is rarely a single transaction. It is accumulation. Each document I collected was neutral, factual, undeniable. At night, I reread my father's letter. He had expected silence. He had assumed discretion would be inherited. He misunderstood me. I did not speak publicly. I did not leak. I did not warn anyone. I documented. Reputation is persuasive. Records are final. Weeks later, an invitation arrived. A reception in Windsor. Anglo-American Policy Forum. Harper scheduled to attend. Trustees present. My name was on the guest list. I accepted. Not for confrontation. For confirmation. In the mirrored halls of Windsor, beneath chandeliers that softened every edge, I moved through conversation like I had been trained to, observing, listening, measuring. Lady Evelyn Ashford approached me near the terrace doors. "You're Michael Reed's daughter," she said. "Yes." He was precise. He was. She studied me for a moment longer than politeness required. Some bridges, she said quietly, aren't meant to fall. It was not advice. It was warning. I held her gaze without expression. Foundations matter, I replied. She smiled, but her eyes did not. Later that evening, I observed Harper in conversation with trustees from the London entity. Laughter, relaxed shoulders, no visible strain. He believed Ironbridge was stable. Most structures do until pressure is applied at the right joint. When I returned to Boston, I finalized the compliance report. It did not accuse. It did not dramatize. It outlined conflicts. It attached minutes. It mapped transfers. I submitted it to the ethics committee with full documentation. No commentary. No press. Within a week, selective details surfaced in investigative reporting. Not from me. Systems protect themselves when tension rises. My last name appeared in print. Reed, daughter of architect, lead analyst on review. Commentators speculated about motive, revenge, legacy dispute. I gave no interviews. Silence is not absence. It is position. Months later, Senator Harper announced his resignation for health reasons. Ironbridge was formally dissolved. The London Trust entered full audit review. During the committee hearing, my name was spoken once. Lead investigator Reed. No irony, no accusation, just function. That day, my last name did not change. Its control over me did. I left the building without ceremony. Outside, the air was cold and unremarkable. Reporters clustered near the entrance, searching for statements. I did not offer one. Reputation survives until it meets documentation. Bridges stand until someone tests the load. Tell me, if you had carried that name, would you have protected it or examined it? Would you have chosen silence or evidence? If you're ready, we can move to the next piece. The reception at Windsor began at dusk. The stone courtyard held the last of the light, pale and restrained, before the doors opened and the room swallowed it. Crystal, polished silver, a quartet positioned near the windows playing something that never demanded attention. Project Ironbridge had funded this event 3 years in a row. I moved through the room without pausing long enough to be remembered. Navy dress, hair secured, expression neutral. My name on the placard read simply, A. Reed. No title. Across the hall, Senator Daniel Harper stood near the central column, one hand resting lightly on a glass he did not drink from. He was older than his photographs suggested, softer at the edges, confident in the way men are when the system has never failed them. 2 trustees from the London entity stood beside him. I recognized one from the meeting minutes attached to my father's letter, Thomas Ellery, Advisory Board. They were discussing infrastructure grants, scholarships, maritime research, benevolent vocabulary. I stood within range but outside their circle, listening. Regulatory climate in New York is tightening, Ellery said lightly. Harper smiled. Temporary. Optics. These cycles pass. Optics. The word settled into me like confirmation. Later that evening, Lady Evelyn Ashford approached again. This time her tone was less measured. You've reopened a file, she said, not asking. I review files, I replied. Her eyes were steady. There are consequences to confusing diligence with disruption. Documentation isn't confusion, I said. She held my gaze a second longer than necessary. Then she shifted her attention to a passing donor. The message had been delivered. The following week, my supervisor called me into his office. The blinds were half drawn. He did not sit immediately. Your audit authority on IRB 47 has generated attention, he said. From? Multiple directions. He handed me a folder. Inside were internal memos requesting reassignment of the file to archival review. The phrasing was careful. Strategic sensitivity, political overlap, reputational risk. None of them referenced evidence. I recommend closure, he said evenly. You've documented enough to satisfy procedural review. Satisfy whom? I asked. He did not answer that directly. You're young in this division, he said. Trajectory matters. Trajectory. My father's word. I left his office without committing to anything. That night, I reviewed the full transactional chain again. The pattern was no longer subtle. American Foundation disburses scholarship funds to London Trust. London Trust allocates advisory fees to Policy Research Consortium. Consortium contracts, consulting firms tied to Harper's legislative donors. Not illegal, not disclosed, systemically corrosive. I did not feel anger, I felt alignment. The structure was elegant, designed by someone who understood both law and perception, my father. 2 days later, I received a formal notice. The IRB 47 file would be moved to closed archive, pending no further action, no justification, just administrative language. I did not object in writing. Instead, I prepared a supplemental memorandum, not argumentative, not accusatory, a simple addendum outlining unresolved disclosure, inconsistencies, and recommending ethics committee review under internal conflict provisions. I attached certified copies of trustee minutes, transfer confirmations, advisory board overlaps. I submitted it directly to the committee. No commentary. 3 weeks passed. Then the first article appeared in a financial journal, not explosive, not sensational. A quiet headline. Questions raised about transatlantic charitable overlap. Ironbridge was mentioned in paragraph 7. Harper's name in paragraph 9. Mine in paragraph 12. Lead analyst declined comment. My phone began receiving calls I did not answer. At the agency, colleagues avoided prolonged eye contact, not hostility, assessment. Silence became accusation in absence of explanation. I offered none. At a closed-door session of the Ethics Committee, I was asked a single question. Did you initiate this review due to personal association? Yes, I said. There was a pause. Clarify. My father engineered portions of the structure, I said. That constitutes potential conflict, which requires disclosure. They studied me carefully. You are aware this implicates your own family name? Yes. No elaboration. Documentation speaks more effectively than defense. The pressure shifted subtly after that. Not overt threats, adjusted tone, invitations withdrawn. Internal reassignment proposals circulated quietly. I continued working standard caseload. I did not volunteer commentary. 2 months later, a second article appeared, this time in a national outlet. Senator Harper linked to undisclosed advisory network. Ironbridge was described as technically compliant but ethically ambiguous. Harper held a press conference the next day. There has been no wrongdoing, he said calmly. Charitable initiatives often require international coordination. No mention of conflict, no mention of my father. Within days, Harper's office announced he would step back from committee leadership to focus on health and family. Language chosen carefully. The London Trust Board scheduled an emergency review. Ironbridge, the structure designed not to fall, began to fragment under light. I was called into my supervisor's office again. This has become public, he said. Yes, your role is under scrutiny. Appropriately. He studied me. You understand you may not advance here. I understand. He nodded once. That was the end of the conversation. Months later, Senator Harper formally resigned. Health reasons. The London Trust entered full audit. Advisory consortium dissolved quietly. Consulting contracts terminated. No indictments, no charges. Just distance. At the final Ethics Committee hearing, my name was spoken without emphasis. Investigator Reed provided structural analysis. Nothing more. When I left the building, the air felt ordinary. Reporters clustered near the entrance. I moved past them without pause. One called my name. I did not turn. That evening, I returned to my father's office for the first time since the memorial. The brownstone was being prepared for sale. Furniture covered in white sheets. I stood in the doorway and let the silence settle. He had believed in insulation, in influence disguised as benevolence, in structures that survived scrutiny because they appeared charitable. He was not careless. He was certain. Certainty erodes under documentation. I walked to his desk and ran my hand once across the polished surface. No anger, no grief, only recognition. Reputation had built his world. Facts had closed it. My last name remained unchanged, Reed, but it no longer dictated alignment. Systems respond to pressure when applied precisely, not loudly, not impulsively, just accurately. I locked the office door behind me and handed the key to the realtor waiting on the sidewalk. There was no applause, no vindication, just space. Tell me, when the system offers you protection in exchange for silence, do you take it? Or do you document what you see and accept the cost? If you're ready, we can continue. After Harper's resignation, the city returned to its usual rhythm. Headlines shifted. Commentators redirected their attention. The word Ironbridge began to disappear from public conversation, replaced by softer phrasing, transition, realignment, private review. Scandals rarely explode. They thin out. At the agency, my reassignment arrived quietly. Analytical division to compliance oversight. Same building, smaller office. No direct audit authority. It was not punishment. It was containment. My supervisor delivered the notice without expression. "This preserves neutrality," he said. "Of the system?" I asked. "Of you." I accepted the transfer. Control does not require proximity. It requires position. Compliance oversight handled disclosures, financial statements submitted by elected officials, foundation boards, and advisory committees. The work was procedural, routine, but procedure reveals patterns. 3 weeks into the new role, a disclosure file crossed my desk bearing a familiar signature. Thomas Ellery, former advisory trustee for the London arm of Ironbridge. His updated filing listed no ongoing foreign advisory relationships, yet the attached schedule of compensation referenced a consulting retainer from a newly formed entity, North Atlantic Civic Initiative, registered in Delaware. I cross-referenced the registration. The directors overlapped with 2 former board members of the dissolved London Trust. Ironbridge had dissolved. Its personnel had not. Structures collapse. People reorganize. I did not flag the file immediately. I documented the overlap. I logged dates. I requested supplemental clarification under standard review procedure. Ellery's office responded within 48 hours. Administrative oversight, the letter read. Clerical misstatement. They attached an amended disclosure. The retainer was now labeled terminated. Termination date, 1 week prior. Documentation arrived too quickly. I did not challenge the correction. I added the original and amended filings to a separate internal log. Patterns accumulate quietly. 2 months later, an interagency bulletin circulated regarding foreign influence review initiatives. Heightened scrutiny, expanded authority. The timing was coincidental or convenient. I requested temporary assignment to the new review team. Granted. The team operated in a windowless conference room on the 4th floor. No name on the door. No external designation. We were tasked with mapping advisory overlaps between domestic policy groups and foreign funding entities. Ironbridge became our internal case study, not by my suggestion, by pattern recognition. As we reconstructed the structure on a whiteboard, the geometry became familiar. Charitable foundation, advisory trust, research consortium, consulting contracts, donor alignment. The same shape appeared in 3 other networks. Different names, similar mechanics. I did not speak about my father. I did not need to. One afternoon, a junior analyst paused mid-sentence. "These networks share the same legal architect," he said. "Who?" I asked evenly. He rotated his laptop toward the group, Michael Reed and Associates. The room went still for a fraction of a second. No one looked at me directly. Professionalism is a discipline. I leaned forward. "Then we document consistently," I said. "No more, no less." Over the next several weeks, the team compiled structural comparisons, not accusations, not conclusions, just architecture. By the time the report was submitted to senior oversight, my father's firm name appeared in 3 appendices. Not central, not exonerated, present. Shortly after, a federal subcommittee announced hearings on charitable disclosure reform. Public framing emphasized systemic modernization. Behind closed doors, staff requested internal analyses. Our report was among them. I was not called to testify. Appropriate. The focus was policy, not individuals. But during the second day of hearings, one line surfaced in the discussion. Legacy advisory frameworks designed in the late 1990s may require retrospective transparency. Legacy. The word held weight. That evening, I returned to my apartment and removed the original Ironbridge letter from my secure file box. I read it again. In the event of destabilizing inquiry, continuity relies on disciplined discretion. My father had trusted silence to preserve continuity. He had not anticipated institutional memory. Systems do not forget, they archive. Weeks later, an article appeared examining Reed-era advisory models. Measured tone, no condemnation, just documentation. My phone remained quiet. No one from my family contacted me. Distance had been restored long ago. One morning, a formal notice arrived from the subcommittee staff. Request for closed briefing. Subject, structural advisory models and disclosure vulnerabilities. My name listed as analyst, not as daughter. The briefing room was plain, long table, carafe of water, no cameras. A staff counsel asked measured questions. How did these frameworks avoid detection? Where did compliance thresholds create concealment opportunities? Were the structures illegal? No, I said. Were they transparent? No. There was a pause. Would enhanced disclosure have altered their viability? Yes. No rhetoric, no judgment, just structural reality. When the briefing concluded, the counsel extended a hand. Thank you, Investigator Reed. Title precise, surname neutral. Outside, the corridor lights flickered softly. I walked past framed portraits of former legislators and felt nothing resembling vindication, only resolution. Months later, new disclosure guidelines were enacted. Advisory overlaps required expanded reporting. Cross-border charitable transfers triggered automatic review. Ironbridge would not have survived under the new rules. My father's architecture had shaped reform, not through praise, through exposure. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I visited his grave for the first time since the memorial. The cemetery overlooked the harbor, wind steady, water gray. I stood without flowers. I did not dismantle you, I said quietly. I documented you. The words felt sufficient. Reputation had been his foundation. Documentation became mine. There is no triumph in that, only balance. As I walked back toward the gate, my phone vibrated once. Unknown number. I let it ring. Silence is not retreat, it is boundary. Tell me. When legacy and integrity diverge, which do you preserve? Would you protect a name or redefine it? If you wish, we can continue. 3 weeks after the disclosure reforms passed, the pressure changed shape. Not external, internal. My reassignment to the interagency review team became permanent. No announcement, no ceremony. My access level expanded quietly. I now reviewed advisory disclosures before they reached public registries. Prevention, they called it. Prevention is quieter than investigation. One morning, a flagged submission appeared in the intake queue. North Atlantic Civic Initiative. Again. The entity Thomas Ellery had amended months prior. The updated filing listed new board appointments. One name stood out. Daniel Harper. Advisory role. Uncompensated. Resigned for health reasons, but not retired. I leaned back in my chair and read the filing twice. Technically permissible. Post-resignation advisory positions were not prohibited. The compensation line was blank. Blank lines are not absence. They are placeholders. I requested supplemental documentation. Within hours, a call came through internal routing. Investigator Reed. The voice was male, controlled, not unfamiliar. This is Daniel Harper. I did not respond immediately. You requested clarification on a voluntary advisory position, he continued. I prefer to address matters directly. Documentation suffices, I said. A brief pause. I understand your position, he said, but you should also understand that public service often continues outside formal office. Disclosure requires transparency, I replied. I have complied. Fully? Silence. Not long, just enough. You've been thorough, he said finally, perhaps excessively. Excess is subjective, he exhaled softly. Your father believed in discretion. Yes, I said. And you? I believe in record. The line went quiet. This is unnecessary, he said at last. The initiative supports civic education. Then disclosure clarifies that. Another pause. You could close this. I could. But you won't. No. The call ended without farewell. I documented the conversation in a supplemental memo. Time, duration, content summary, no interpretation. By the end of the week, additional filings surfaced. North Atlantic Civic Initiative had entered into a consulting agreement with a policy research group recently awarded a federal contract. The pattern was familiar, different names, same geometry. I convened a review session with 2 senior analysts. We mapped the structure on a whiteboard. Foundation, advisory, research, contract. Ellery's name linked 2 of them. Harper's advisory role linked another. No illegality. Yet. Is this preemptive? One analyst asked quietly. Yes, I said. On what grounds? Historical pattern replication. They did not argue. Documentation accumulated. A preliminary compliance notice was issued requiring expanded disclosure of advisory influence under revised regulations. North Atlantic responded publicly this time. A press release framed the request as administrative overreach. My name did not appear, but the tone was familiar. That evening, I returned home later than usual. My building lobby was empty. The elevator hummed. When I reached my floor, I noticed an envelope on the floor outside my door. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Bridges rebuilt are harder to see. No signature, no threat, just observation. I did not feel fear. I felt confirmation. The next morning, I reported the note through internal security channels. Routine, documented, archived. I did not alter my pace. 2 weeks later, the review team received notification that North Atlantic Civic Initiative had withdrawn its federal contract bid. Voluntarily, the advisory role listing was amended again. Harper's name removed. Ellery resigned from the board. No press conference, no statement. Just quiet revision. The geometry dissolved before it solidified. Prevention. Months passed. The review team's authority expanded further under new legislative guidelines. Advisory overlaps required proactive clearance before acceptance of federal contracts. Structures had to be visible before they formed. One afternoon, my supervisor closed the door to my office. "You understand you've limited certain opportunities," he said. "Yes. Your trajectory could have been different." "I know." He studied me for a moment. "Why continue?" "Because reputation without scrutiny rots. Because systems without friction calcify. Because silence, inherited unexamined, becomes complicity." Instead, I said, "Because patterns repeat." He nodded once. Outside, autumn settled over the city. Leaves pressed against sidewalks. Wind carried the scent of cold water. On a quiet evening, I walked again to the harbor. The skyline reflected in dark waves. My father had believed in insulation, in shaping perception so precisely that scrutiny seemed unnecessary. He had not anticipated a daughter who learned the same discipline but chose a different application. Read. The name still opened certain rooms. Now it also closed others. I accepted both. The following spring, I received formal confirmation. Promotion. Director of Structural Compliance Review. The title was administrative, the authority practical. I did not celebrate. I reorganized the intake process. Ironbridge became a training module, not a scandal, as architecture. This is how it was built, I told new analysts, and this is how it was revealed. No drama, just design. One evening, as I prepared to leave the office, I found another envelope on my desk. Internal routing, no sender. Inside was a single photograph, a bridge over dark water, steel frame, no identifying marks. On the back, handwritten, "Foundations matter." I held it for a moment. Then I placed it in my secure file drawer. I did not search for its source. Sometimes acknowledgement is enough. At home, I stood by the window overlooking the city and considered the distance traveled, from memorial to memorandum, from legacy to ledger. My last name had not changed. Its function had. Reputation can conceal. Documentation reveals. And structures, no matter how carefully built, answer eventually to wait. Tell me, if the system adapts to scrutiny, do you ease the pressure or do you continue to test its load? If you wish to go further, we can continue. The last hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning. No press release, no cameras, just a final procedural session to close the reform cycle that Ironbridge had quietly set in motion. I arrived early. The corridor outside the committee room was empty, the carpet patterned in muted blue and gray, designed not to draw attention. My name was printed on a temporary placard at the end of the table. A. Reed Director, Structural Compliance Review. No reference to my father, no reference to Harper, no mention of Ironbridge, just function. The room filled slowly. Staff counsel, 2 senators, a clerk who arranged binders with careful alignment. I reviewed my notes once, then closed the folder. When the session began, the questions were procedural. Have the new cross-border disclosure requirements been implemented? Yes. Are advisory overlaps now automatically flagged? They are. Is there any remaining vulnerability in the previous framework? I paused. Only where discretion is mistaken for integrity, I said. The chair studied me for a moment, then nodded. That will be noted. No one said my father's name. No one said Harper's. The system had absorbed the correction and moved on. When the hearing concluded, the senators stood, shook hands, and exited through a private door. Staff began collecting papers. The clerk removed my placard and placed it in a recycling bin. Temporary authority. Temporary presence. I walked out into the late morning light. The air was cold and clean. Across the street, traffic moved with steady indifference. My phone vibrated once. A message from an unknown number. Your father would have handled this differently. No signature. I deleted it without responding. He would have handled it differently. He would have negotiated, contained, redirected. He believed in insulation. I believed in weight-bearing structures. That afternoon, I returned to the brownstone one final time. The sale had closed. The new owners would take possession the next day. The rooms were empty now. No leather chair, no framed degrees, only faint impressions on the walls where the sunlight had not reached. I walked into his former office and stood in the center of the room. The floor creaked softly under my weight. For years, I had imagined this room as a place of power. Decisions made here had shaped careers, reputations, trajectories. Now it was just space. I removed a small box from my bag. Inside were the original Ironbridge letter and the architectural diagrams I had copied from his files. I placed them on the bare floor. I did not tear them. I did not burn them. Destruction is dramatic. Documentation is not. Instead, I slid the originals into a sealed archival envelope addressed to the Federal Records Repository, referencing the Reform Act that had passed. Permanent retention, institutional memory, no private control. When I finished, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and allowed myself a single, steady breath. For most of my life, Reed had meant alignment with his design. Tonight, it meant something else. Not rebellion, not revenge, separation. I stood, turned off the lights, and locked the door. Outside, the harbor wind moved through the narrow street, lifting the edge of my coat. I walked toward the water without looking back. At the pier, I stopped. Boats shifted against their lines. Steel cables held under tension, quiet and reliable. Bridges stood in the distance, fixed against the sky. They did not announce their strength. They carried weight without comment. My phone rang once more. This time, the caller ID displayed a familiar name, Evelyn Ward. I answered. "There will always be new structures," she said without greeting. "Yes. You've made certain they are harder to hide." That was the point. A pause. "And your name?" she asked. "It remains mine," I said. No embellishment, no defense. After I ended the call, I opened my email and drafted a brief internal request. Effective immediately, all public filings and testimonies would list my full professional designation without familial reference. No more contextual footnotes, no more legacy assumptions, just position. I pressed send. The sun dipped lower over the harbor. The water darkened. I thought of the first night I opened the crimson-sealed letter in his office, of the weight of the wax breaking under my thumb, of the moment my last name turned from inheritance into liability. Names do not change on their own. They shift when their meaning does. I walked away from the pier and toward the city lights. Tomorrow, the intake queue would be full again. New disclosures, new patterns, new attempts at insulation. I would review them, not because of my father, not because of Harper, but because systems require friction to remain honest. Reed no longer controlled me. It identified me. That was enough. Before we leave this story, tell me something. If the structure you inherited was built on silence, would you preserve it? Or would you let the weight of truth reshape it? And if this kind of quiet reckoning speaks to you, stay. There are more stories like this to tell.